Hi, everyone. It is wonderful to welcome you all to this festive occasion, the launch of the important volume on the diary, edited by my esteemed colleagues, Batsheva Ben-Amos and Ben-Amos, who happen to also be my dear friends. The diary, the epic of everyday life, published by Indiana University Press, consolidates recent scholarly efforts by bringing together studies that highlight the diary as a literary genre. The 7 parts of this volume encompass different countries and cultures. The first 2, diary theories and the creation of a diary canon, are theoretical and historical, while the third, the transformation of the manuscript, deals with diary publication, modes of diary preservation, and published editions. The section on the travel diary, the private diary, and online diaries explore important subgenres. Finally, the diary in political conflict deals with the manifestations of this genre in times of war, totalitarian regimes, and colonialism. The many authors that are represented in this book study the personal diary in its many forms and highlight the public face of private life. It is my pleasure to introduce the 2 editors of this volume. Batsheva Ben-Amos teaches genres of life writing in the comparative literature program and in the College of Professional and Liberal Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. She has written about Holocaust diaries and on the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik. Especially notable is her work on a multilingual diary written in Ghetto Lodge between May and August 1944, and a diary by Chaim Kaplan, which starts in 1933 and culminates in 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto. Just the dates are enough to move us all. She has also written on Bialik's famous epic poem, In the City of Slaughter. Dr. Ben-Amos is a practicing clinician as well. Dan Ben-Amos teaches courses on fairy tales, humor, Jewish folklore, and African folklore, as well as the history and theory of folklore in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his many writings, I will mention only Sweet Words, Folklore in Context, Folklore Concepts, and the 3 volumes of Folk Tales of the Jews. He also published many seminal articles on the folklore genre and the definition of folklore. Let us now listen to Batsheva and Dan interview each other about the inception of this project.
All right.
Batsheva.
Well,
Dan,
yeah.
go ahead.
I may know the answer, but I still will ask you the question. How did your interest in diaries start?
Well, it started when I read the diary of Anne Frank after becoming aware in a young age of the Holocaust atrocities. You might say that it was a traumatic experience since I kept coming back to it by reading everything I could put my hands on: memoirs, history books, diaries, watching documentaries and movies. The diaries had a special significance for me since they were voices from the real time and place, or as Sarah Horowitz called, voices from the killing grounds. It seems to me now that I was trying to bring them back to life with their experiences, their feelings, through their diaries. This is how my interest in Holocaust diaries and my research began and continued.
So what prompted you to expand to the diary genre?
Well, my interest in all types of diaries in different countries, languages, and historical periods always existed. But a push to expand for my research and writing focus on Holocaust diaries came, ironically, with the rise of trauma theories in the scholarly literature. It goes back to the 1990s when the psychiatrist Dory Laub from Yale interviewed survivors and wrote that although victims wrote diaries and chronicles, took secret pictures, and escaped from camps to warn the world, their attempts to inform themselves and others were doomed because the necessary awareness and comprehension were beyond the human ability and willingness to grasp and transmit the events. He thought that only a sympathetic therapist can elicit the testimony. This clinical therapeutic approach evolved later further in literary analysis, but it still was problematic, I thought. After all, these autobiographical writings were so effective that the readers and researchers themselves, who did not share such experiences nor memories with the writers, often became traumatized. It occurred to me that the Holocaust diaries were never examined as a generic context, in a generic context. So I delved into the genre theory to diaries written during different turbulent times and periods and to more major diary types. So that's my answer.
Thank you.
I have now two questions of you, Dan, for you. All right.
Okay.
You're a folklorist. What interests you about diaries?
Well, being a folklorist, that does not mean that I don't have interest in other things. But as far as the diary is concerned, the answer, Batsheva, is very simple. You. You introduced me to the diaries, to the subject, to the scholarship, and convinced me of its importance. I could integrate it into my scholarly interest in folklore because of two reasons. From the perspective of literary criticism, the diary is a marginal genre, like people consider folklore to be marginal. And from perspectives of anthropology of literacy, the diary is liminal between and betwixt the public and the private. And this was of great interest to me.
Okay, so in your opinion, how does the book contribute to the humanities?
Well, in many ways, but let me just address two of them. The subtitle of the book succinctly states the first contribution, namely, the diary is the epic of everyday life. While the traditional epic, and this time I can speak as a folklorist, because I recorded epics in Africa, is a story of heroic battles and grand victories. Our daily life may consist of petty battles and micro victories and failures. Nevertheless, they become the tapestry of our existence. Secondly, the contribution to the humanities, the artistic and philosophical dimension of humanism, is generated by agents who train themselves to do so professionally. They are the professional writers, the professional artists, the professional verbal and visual and musical artists and the trained philosophers. The diary writers are not necessarily professionals. Sometimes professionals write diaries, but then they are their private matter. Therefore, the diary is the medium through which every man and a woman could express his or her humanism in a crude, unpolished, and unpublic form. In some, it is the humanities of every day.
Thank you. Thank you. I especially like the fact that Batsheva is the reason you became interested in the diary. But I have another question. I have a question. So you're both intellectual partners, but also a married couple. Could you reveal to us a little bit about the experience of working together? So Dan, if you
Well, like anything else we do together, it was part of our life. At times we had to schedule specific times to discuss one detail or another, but other than that, it was part of our daily communication. I should, however, point out that Batsheva is the principal editor. She selected the contributors, wrote and communicated with them. She is the diary scholar in the family.
Thanks, Dan. Well, it has been fairly smooth since Dan let me decide. No, seriously, we had a division of labor. It sort of developed on its own. I made decisions about the book's outline and content decisions since it is my area. I was also in charge of most of the correspondence with the contributors and with the press since we wanted clear, consistent, and effective communication. When it was necessary, we discussed issues before I wrote. Dan has a long editorial experience and he helped with editorial advice. It was really very generous of him to help. We both did the edits of most chapters and he oversaw bibliographies and footnotes, and sometimes it was not a simple matter. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. At this point, I will pass the baton to the able hands of the chief editor, as Dan called her, Batsheva Ben-Amos, who will call on the panelists to speak. To save time, however, each panelist will introduce him or herself in their respective research area.
Okay, now we will start the conversation with Stephen Cagle, who contributed a chapter about the American diary canon. Please introduce yourself, Stephen.
Okay, hi. I started work on diaries about 56 years ago. At that time, diaries, which had long been read and basically studied, they were studied as sources for information or studies of individual diarists, somebody who had a particular interest in the writer. But there was no real discussion of diaries as a form. There were no standards for having to judge a particular diary, especially as a work of literature. And I didn't realize that when I started my work. I did my dissertation on the diary of John Adams, and I didn't really, I think, understand it until about 1967 when I started to work on a book on American diaries, which ended up being 3 books. And at that time, I had to realize that nobody really understood what the diary canon was. Batsheva, you wanted to ask me about the canon, I think?
Yeah, oh yeah, I have a question for you.
Sure.
What are some of the bases from which diary canons tend to emerge? Nation, language, country, culture, literary qualities?
Well, I am going to, of course, focus on American diaries because those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. As I said, when I started work, there was no established canon. I naively thought that there was. I mean, I saw what was in the anthologies. And then when I started trying to choose which works to look at, and I started reading thousands of diaries, I went through Matthew's book. listing all the published diaries and spent time in libraries going through all those. And I realized that the ones that were in the anthologies were probably not the ones that were most desirable to be considered. I mean, for example, Samuel Sewell's diary, which was the one that was most often in the anthologies, was put in there because there were a couple of interesting events that he mentions briefly, or a couple of sustained, a couple of page sections which had some perhaps cohesive interests. But taken as a whole, the work was fragmentary, a lot of little notes, not the kind of thing that you're talking about if we're talking about diaries as a literary form. So I started looking at that, and I found several that had been totally ignored, especially ones that I would hold up as examples of things that deserve to be considered as works of literature. For example, I'll mention a couple of my favorites. One is the diary of Michael Wigglesworth, best known as a poet for writing a very puritanical work called Day of Doom. Such a pop work that was so popular that almost there are no first editions that exist. They were read to pieces, even though it was the most widely published book. Anyway, his diary is really self-contained, and it gets into something that I'll talk about later. Another is Sarah Kemble's early 18th century travel diary. It's a humorous, picaresque tale filled with her own poetry, and it's given shape by the journey itself. In other words, the diary has a form because the journey has a start and an end. Wigglesworth, as I'll explain later, also has a start and an end. It starts when he's starting out at Harvard as a tutor, and he sees himself as a child, and it ends when he realizes he's going to become a parent, when he has made the transition from child to father. And almost as soon as that happens, the diary starts to disintegrate. It goes on for a few more entries, and that's it, because the diary has a cohesive form and a cohesive shape. Another one is Nancy Shippen Livingston's, which reads as a tragic romance. It begins when she realizes that she's been pressured by her parents into a marriage with a rich philanderer, and it ends when she of course had married him instead of the man she really loved. And finally, after all kinds of terrible things, she wants to get a divorce, and her husband says, "I'll give you a divorce if you give up our daughter." And she won't, and she loses the man she loves for a second time, and the diary really ends. She and her daughter end up their lives as religious recluses. There's Charlotte Fortin's diary, where we have an African-American woman who goes to the Sea Islands during the Civil War to teach freed slaves. Again, it has its form, it has its shape. There's a romance that takes place, an interracial romance, which she breaks down because she realizes that society would never tolerate it. And then I point out Thoreau's, for another reason, Thoreau's journal, which there's been some talk and some comments which suggest that the journal, which was the basis for Walden, a lot of Walden is revised diary. And some people, have argued that it's in some ways better than the revised passages in Walden itself. And I want to point out at this point that works such as this particular book that we're discussing today is the kind of thing that I've always felt was needed, that we needed something to help scholars and students and even ordinary readers find the diaries that deserve a place in the canon and understand how those diaries should be read and analyzed. And this book provides a basis for those kinds of discussions, which of course will be very important in the classroom. we were talking just before this discussion formally started about questions and answers. And what I liked about this book, among other things, is that it raises questions that we would want to discuss and argue about. For example, one of the questions Elizabeth Pudnick writes about is asserting that the diary is open-ended. I really like the article, but I'd really like to discuss ways, like I've suggested with Wigglesworth and some of the others I just mentioned, how some diaries do have a form, and Michael Broad mentions about Henrietta de Saules, how she married the man she loved at 21 and quit keeping a diary. Certain life situations restrict the diary. I've mentioned in my writings that there's a difference between diaries of situation and life diaries. So life diaries we can consider open-ended. The diary situation have something that gives it a form. And I think I've run out of my 5 minutes, and I will pause here and thank everybody for participating. And of course, thank the Ben-Amos for this book.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Now I invite Kimberly Katz, who wrote about Palestinian diaries during war and colonialism. Kimberly, can you first introduce yourself, and then I'll ask the question.
Yes, my name is Kimberly Katz. I'm a professor of Middle East history at Towson University, and my research has long focused on the modern history of Palestine and Jordan.
Okay, now, did the writing models of Arab diary writers originate from Arab traditions, whether tribal or national, or did they imitate European models?
So my second book, A Young Palestinian's Diary, which was published in 2009, which includes my translation of World War II diary, the World War II Diary of Palestinian Sami Amr, that might suggest a British Mandate context and influence, because that's when he lived. The book for today that we're launching, in my chapter, I compare Sami's World War II diary to another Palestinian diary, that of Ihsan Turjman, who also lived in Jerusalem and wrote during World War I. As Ihsan lived under Ottoman imperial rule rather than British rule, we need to look more broadly to see the literary influences on young Palestinian diary writers in the first half of the 20th century. Now, in my book, I note that it's important to go beyond the Western literary tradition to understand diary writing in different cultures. And to do that, I delved into the Islamic historiographical tradition and other forms of Arabic literary self-writing, something that Jews, Christians, and Muslims engaged in. So just as travelers and monks in medieval Europe left us their personal writings, so too did medieval Muslims and Arabs leave manuscripts with their thoughts and reflections on their societies. Now, the noted Islamic studies scholar George Muqtasi, who was professor and later professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, our hosts for today, he argued that, quote, in striking contrast to the West, Islam developed the diary very early in its history, end quote. And he looks to the 11th century diary of Ibn Banna for his claim to a separate and distinct historiographical tradition in the Islamic world from that in Europe. Now, I don't think that we can draw a straight line from the 11th century to the World War I and World War II writings of Palestinian diarists, but I do think we need to recognize the distinctions of Arabic writers across the centuries. The Arabic terms for writings of the self has changed over time. Early on, they were referred to as self-biography or sira dhatiya in Arabic, or interpretations of the self, tarjama shakhsiya. And more recently, words like memoirs or mudhakkarat have been used. In my work, I argue that what Sami and Ihsan wrote was a diary, a yomiyat, or a dailies, basically, as both writers dated their entries. Now, while Ihsan wrote quite regularly, Sami wrote more sporadically, but nevertheless maintained his diary over 4 years during World War II. He also included a variety of writing genres in his diary, including letters and poems and political expositions and other genres. So what about direct influences on these two Palestinian writers? Well, Palestinian cultural and political and military elites kept diaries during the Mandate, as did Jews and British officials in Mandate Palestine. Ihsan had a clear mentor in the noted Palestinian intellectual and educator Khalil Sakakini, whose diary has been published in 8 volumes in Arabic, and who encouraged his protege Ihsan to keep a diary. While Sami was a voracious reader, his diary offers no indication who might have influenced his writing, which he began after he finished formal schooling, 7th grade, at the age of 16. I chose to compare Sami and Ihsan's diaries in my chapter in this diary volume because they bookend a distinct and critical period of modern Palestinian history, while also reflecting on the lives and experiences of young Palestinian men. They both lived and experienced World War and witnessed the end of empire in Palestine during their lives, and they wrote about it. They both reflected on the role that the government should play to make people's lives better, or at the very least, to alleviate suffering. They both experienced and reflected on the social expectations of their society and the role of morality in it, as each writes of concern for his sexual morality. And so it's on that topic that I thought I would share some excerpts from each of these Palestinian diarists. For Ihsan, his military supervisor had been pursuing him, and Ihsan called this, quote, the ugliest and vilest months for him. He wrote on August 17th, 1916, that his commander, quote, came over and said that he wanted to kiss me between the eyes. My face became pale and I wanted to beat him up, but I decided to control myself. He came back. Do not fear, he said. I do not want to harm you. I love you tremendously. God knows why, for I cannot bear this situation anymore, end quote. Ihsan contemplated committing suicide over this for the sake of his honor, but worried about his parents if he did so. Ihsan was abruptly murdered by an Ottoman officer in very unclear circumstances just prior to the arrival of British General Allenby in December 1917. Sami had his own conflicting pressures from society regarding his sexual desires. 2 women affected him most significantly before he got engaged to a cousin in 1944. One was a young Jewish woman, Tzipora, whom he worked with in a British office, and he felt snubbed by when she married a much older man. The other woman, Aldo, an Italian woman from whom Sami rented a room, made him feel like he was trapped between her maternal tendencies and her possibility of sort of trapping him into an unwanted romantic relationship. He wrote on April 2nd, 1942, quote, she tires herself out making me content, and she finds happiness being near me without my doing anything. She frequently visits me and asks me to come to her house. Will she turn my life upside down, or will she throw me to the ground, as happens to young men who follow their loves and follow their passions? Your mercy, O God, free me from this frightening nightmare whenever I imagine myself in such a situation of moral depravity, end quote. And I'll just conclude by saying that with limitations on the availability of and access to Arab archives, historians benefit from rare family papers like diaries, which offer the opportunity to study unusual and lesser known accounts of history while bringing to readers a deeper understanding of the complexities of individuals and the lives they led. And I just want to thank the editors for including me and my work in this collection of essays.
Oh, pleasure. Okay, thanks. Now I invite Jim Hargett, who contributed a chapter on travel diaries in Imperial China. Jim, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the gracious invitation to allow me to contribute a very humble essay to the wonderful volume, and for the invitation to participate today with such a distinguished array of scholars. I grew up in Taiwan. My connection is I went to school there as a young lad up through middle school, and then came back to the States. My family has a China connection. My dad was with General Chennault in China in World War II. So we have a strong family connection to things Chinese. I've been teaching Chinese as a foreign language and Chinese literature, not as long as Professor Kegel, but I am almost at 35 years. And through those years, my number one priority research topic has been travel writing and travel literature. I'm not promoting anything, but I was finally able to finish a literary history of Chinese travel writing and get it published in 2018 by the University of Washington Press. If anyone's interested or they read it, they have questions, please absolutely feel free to email me. I'm always available. I think a good place, I have about 4 or 5 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, but well, what I wanted to ask you is that
Okay.
what model of writing did the Chinese travel diary writers use?
That
And
is a great question.
You have five minutes.
All right, great. Let me start by saying what Chinese diaries are not. Okay, under the influence of Confucianism, right? Personal diaries of the sort that we talk about today did not exist in traditional China. Personal in the sense that the writer of the diary would reflect, reveal his or her innermost feelings about anything. That was taboo in traditional ancient Chinese society. Matters, personal matters, family matters were not for public consumption under any circumstance, right? Now, but travel writing became very, very popular in China. Believe it or not, as early as the 9th century, China's first travel diary dates from 809. And in the period or dynasty that followed that, the S-O-N-G, the Song dynasty, actually travel writing proliferated in China. Many, many people were writing travel diaries. Who were writing these diaries? These were mostly government officials, because they were the people who were literate. And as government officials, they would typically, like our State Department people today, I used to work in the State Department, every 3 years or so, they'd shift you to a different location. So these government officials under this S-O-N-G Song dynasty traveled greatly throughout their careers and got into the habit practice of writing about the places that they would go visit. More than often, these were sightseeing attractions, a famous mountain, say, a famous temple, a famous battleground in history, etc. And what these diarists tried to do, because more than anything else, these travel diaries were literary works. That's where my interest is in travel diaries as works of literature. They were interested in these diaries of displaying their talents as wordsmiths. And what they tried to do was to create word pictures with words, right? Create pictures that would allow the reader, right, to vicariously experience the trip, the sights and sounds and things seen by the author. This is hard to do, but this is the measure, at least I've been using, to distinguish the so-so travel writers from the great travel writers. The places that were most often visited were what I call cultural heritage sites. I don't know if we have this in our Western European tradition or not, but say a famous place like Mount Tai, T-A-I, in Eastern China. This was a famous place for thousands of years. Right? Emperors went there. People went there for thousands of years. Many officials who traveled there wrote diaries describing the place. But if you were to go there, say later in Chinese history, you would be expected to read all those earlier accounts and somehow take them into account when writing your own account. And invariably you're compared. And this is another stick measure we can use to evaluate writers. In my essay for the volume we're talking about today, I talk about China's greatest travel diarist. His name is really hard to say in English. In Chinese, it's Xu Xiake, Mr. Xu, X-U is the usual spelling. He left 3 volumes of books, if you can see my fingers, this thick, of his travels around China over 30 years. If you are going to read some Chinese travel writing, I strongly suggest, and there are some English translations available, I strongly suggest that you pick up this volume and read. It will give you a very, very accurate sense of how Chinese writers wrote about their travels. That's about what I've got. If there are any questions, I would be glad to answer, of course.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Okay, I call upon Elizabeth Podnieks, who wrote about the private diaries of professional authors, to introduce herself, and then I'll ask her a question.
Hey, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank our editors, just to start by, for their incredible efforts in producing this exciting and impressive collection, and also comparative literature and Jewish studies at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm Liz Podnieks, a professor in the Department of English at Ryerson University in Toronto. My teaching and research interests include modernism, motherhood studies, women's literatures, and of course, life writing. My current project is a monograph on representations of mothers in, among other things, modernist autobiography.
Okay. Now my question to you is, do professional authors also adhere to generic expectations and canonic conventions, or being more individualistic, they initiate changes or even use their diaries to enhance their art?
Yeah, super, thank you. While the diary has traditionally been regarded as a private document, we've already been talking about that, composed daily and spontaneously, in my chapter for the collection, I challenge conventional thinking about genre by focusing on how literary diarists manifest their aesthetic sensibilities and ambitions within and by the diary. So published diaries kept by English language authors from the 19th century to the present constitute a rich and distinct life writing tradition. This tradition is traceable to the marketing of the private diary in published form in the early 1800s, a practice that permanently shifted the public and artistic directions of the genre. For instance, in his introduction to the Diary of Samuel Pepys, William Matthews exposes how Pepys's 17th century diary is in fact highly crafted. Pepys often wrote up to 14 days at once. He culled information not only from his personal notes, but from news books, and he frequently revised his entries after rereading them. So Pepys's published diary served as a blueprint for future journalists, so that by the 19th century, diarists increasingly viewed their habit as a literary one. With more and more samples entering the marketplace, Lawrence Rosenwald declares that well-read diarists were surely considering the posthumous independent publication of their diaries and inevitably thinking of them as books. So indeed, consider the example of feminist author Virginia Woolf. Woolf started her journal in 1897 when she was 15, and she sustained this lifelong project until her death in 1941. In his introduction to volume 1 of her published diary, Quentin Bell calls it a major work, a masterpiece, and a literary achievement. So among its other functions, Woolf's diary was instrumental in helping her achieve her literary goals. She used it to chart her stringent work ethic and as a training ground for her fiction. So for example, she explains in one entry, "It strikes me that in this book, I practice writing, do my scales, yes, and work at certain effects. I dare say I practice Jacob's room here and Mrs. Dalloway, and shall invent my next book here." Woolf clearly approached the diary itself as literature. She frequently imagined it in fictional terms, commenting on one entry, "Now there's a chapter in a novel." As such, she sought to preserve narrative continuity. She closes one report by noting, London yesterday, a violent storm of wind all night, garden, a litter of apple and branches. A few days later, she updated the diary. Yes, it was a terrific storm. All the trees chocolate brown on the wind side, little leaves like chipped potatoes. So Woolf's aesthetic concerns are connected, then unsurprisingly, to her sense of external audience. She discloses of the diary, I suppose a reader sometimes for the sake of variety when I write. It makes me put on my dress clothes. In order to reach this reader, Woolf contemplates publication. She theorized the genre in her now famous entry on April 20th, 1919, asking, what sort of diary should I like mine to be? Something loose-knit and yet not slovenly. Like any good novelist, she affirms of the diarist, a little effort is needed to face a character or an incident which needs to be recorded. Nor can one let the pen write without guidance for fear of becoming slack and untidy. She adds, even this unpremeditated scribbling has its form, which one learns. And we can see then that she spent her career learning and conveying to her future readers the literary tenets of the journal. So in closing, Lawrence Rosenwald argues that the notion that diaries are necessarily private is simply false. He insists that diaries be located within a system of production and distribution, not unlike that of the novel. With their heightened consciousness of artistic form, literary authors are arguably more aware than others of the aesthetic possibilities of the diary. I agree with Lindsay Bloom that for a professional writer, there are no private writings because, as she says, once a writer, like an actor, is audience-oriented, such considerations as telling a good story, getting the sounds and the rhythm right, supplying sufficient detail can never be excluded. All writers know this. A professional writer is never off duty. Woolf is an example of a feminist literary diarist who was consistently on duty as she employed her diaries to negotiate private and public thoughts. She wrote with an awareness of a tradition of literary diaries, just as she helped to define it and contribute to its expansion. And her journals, like the diaries, the other diaries I explore in my chapter, are repositories of art that became, in the end, the work of art itself.
Great. So, talking about feminist writing, I called Catherine Carter, who wrote about feminist interpretations of the diary for the book. Catherine?
Hi there. My name's Catherine Carter, and I've been a scholar of diary writing for some time now, going back 20 odd years, with a particular interest in 19th century diaries and diaries written in Canada. So that's sort of where I've come to the discussion today. And thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here. So Catherine will touch upon theories and conceptual frameworks of analyzing diaries. She will focus on some of the unique theoretical challenges in writing, reading, and thinking about diaries because of our assumptions about diaries as a privileged or unique genre of writing.
Thanks. So for me, the act and the art of keeping a diary leads critical discussions to some really essential questions within literary studies. And that is what keeps me coming back, I think, over and over to diaries. What compels us to keep a record of our life in the first place? What compels us to tell stories? Even in situations where the author faces extraordinarily difficult circumstances, whether they are imprisoned on a rolling ship at sea without proper pen and paper, in a Soviet gulag, under injunctions maybe that would forbid them to write, the author still looks for a way to leave a record. And this is true, of course, for women as well, who sometimes have faced additional challenges in terms of social or material injunctions that would prevent them from leaving a life record. And you can think of things here like access to literacy as being one sort of basic kind of difficulty. If you don't have the skills to use pen and paper, it makes leaving a record of your life that much more difficult. Diarists look to leave a record of their life even when it seems certain that no one will read their writing. So the question is, why do we write? And as I said, this is one of the key attractions to studying diaries at all. The opening chapters in this wonderful collection of essays, all of them help us sort of think through this question and some of the particular and unique features about diary writing and diary reading. So, overall, the essays in this volume, I think, are helping us tease out our assumptions about the diary as a privileged or unique genre. Is it especially authentic or truthful? Can it be used as evidence or testimony? Is it a specialized form of autobiography? And if so, is that because it has a different relationship to time? And I've written about that elsewhere, trying to think through some of the changes to our understanding and systematizing of time and how that might have shaped our understanding of what we're doing in a diary. Is the diary specialized because it has some sort of a relationship to narrative that is different from other autobiographical forms? Some readers really enjoy that elliptical way that diary plots seem to move, never really knowing what their end is. Is the diary a specialized genre because it has an integrated connection to the formation of selfhood? Unlike other forms of autobiography, perhaps, the diary is always iterative, poking itself tentatively into future versions of the self, trying on versions of the self, trying on different ways of thinking about who you might be. An additional question that I think that emerges from this is, can diaries said to be a form of literature? And some of you have already talked about this in your comments. Are they artful? I think this is another really compelling question. Are they conceived of as a coherent document, either by the author or the reader? Or, as Julie Rack asks in her essay in this collection, is the diary more of a process than a product? That's a lot of questions. And it seems to me there's at least 3 different things we need to attend to when we're looking at a diary. One is what the author had in mind when writing the diary, of course, but just as important is a consideration of what were the circumstances under which they wrote that diary. It seems to me that any critical framework for understanding diaries needs to think about the cultural pressures and historical moment in which a diary was written, because that has so much to do in terms of shaping what a person can or can't do in acts of self-representation. The very material fact of the text itself is something we must also learn to grapple with. Can we develop a scholarly and critical language to help us understand the various formats in which a manuscript diary exists? And I think that's another really fruitful way of us conceptualizing diary writing. On top of that, do we have new ways of representing those manuscript diaries in digital format so that we are better able to assess the originals? And Kylie Cardell talks about that, of course, in this essay collection. If we need to think about the author and their historical moment, we must also think about the reader and their historical moment. So this brings us more clearly into the realm of what critics are doing with diaries. We can think about this work by looking at some of the interpretive approaches taken to diaries over the last 40 or 50 years. My chapter in this book particularly focuses on how diaries intersect with feminist approaches. And what I tried to do in that essay is unpack a number of the assumptions that we bring to diaries, and particularly to diaries written by people who would identify as being female. And the question that I asked is, how can diaries be feminine if the term itself is unstable? And what damage do scholars wittingly, unwittingly enact by insisting on a relationship, a contiguous relationship between the diary and its writer? And what do we mean when we say a diary is emotive, that it's about emotions? What do we mean by that? And finally, what do we mean when we say that a diary is private? Some of that work around, whether or not the diary is private. We just heard from Liz Podniaks talking about the fact that the diary is perhaps never private. And she quotes Laura Rosenwald, who talked about this in really useful ways. So what is that diary doing in fiction? The role of readers, to sort of try to put a big bow around all of this, what I would say is that the role of the reader of diaries, the kind of ethical relationship that exists between the reader and this particular genre, and that critical relationship is one that needs a great deal of self-reflection and a great deal of scrutiny. I'll just give a shout out as well to Desiree Henderson, who's written a beautifully compact and really useful overview called How to Read a Diary that just came out. And she's got a whole set of questions that I think are very helpful in guiding our thoughts about how to read a diary. So she's sort of bundled it into a variety of sections: the diary as literature, diaries as fiction, diaries as manuscript, and online diaries. I think those are all really valuable ways of us trying to crack into this discussion about what the diaries, how to frame and critically understand diaries. They might seem to be a kind of text that's removed from the world, very private and very individualized, but scholarship in the last half century has shown diaries to be a wonderfully complicated site of self-representation, always in process, never sure how to shape its narrative towards a particular ending, always in dialogue with imagined readers who represent a cultural moment, in dialogue with the imagined readers who might represent a kind of ideal of diary writing, like Virginia Woolf might be for some of us, or in dialogue with real readers who are actually looking over their shoulder of the diarist, and we know that that happened. And finally, in dialogue with those of us who are trained literary readers and come along with our own biases and questions and our own interests in this particular form of writing. So I think I might leave my comments there, and always happy to talk about diaries to anyone who wants to keep talking to me about them.
Batsheva, you're muted.
Thank you. You're right. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Now, our next section, we focus on the personal diary in political conflict. So I invite Kimberly Harrison, who wrote about Confederate women's diaries during the American Civil War, to comment about writing diaries in political conflict. So please introduce yourself and then, talk.
It's wonderful to be here, and thanks so much to the editors for inviting me to contribute to this valuable collection. I've been writing about Confederate women's diaries for about 20 years after I just by chance came across the diary of Priscilla Bond in the archives at LSU. As a rhetorical scholar, I use rhetoric as a lens to analyze and interpret these women's diaries. I'm a professor of English at Florida International University and direct the writing programs there. In this talk, I'll focus on why elite Confederate women turned to their diaries during the American Civil War. Their diaries served a number of purposes, some of which I'll outline here. Before the war began, many elite white Southern women kept or had kept diaries. But with the war, the diary's functions expanded and shifted in response to the national context and its impact on specific writers' lives. One purpose the diary served was as a personal history of the war, one that was written with the diarist families and their future selves in mind. Many elite diarists, white women Confederate diarists, began their wartime diary with regret that they hadn't started writing sooner. For example, one young diarist in Virginia began writing in 1863, lamenting, "I regret so much not writing some events of the past few years as they occurred. that now have concluded to commence now. In their personal history, these diarists describe themselves as participants in the war. And the diarists that I have studied do support the Confederacy in one degree or another, and are very interested in the success of this new nation in order to maintain their privileges. So in their diaries, they do present themselves as, partners in this nation building effort. And they detail their activities, whether it's knitting for the soldiers, writing encouraging letters to those on the battlefield, or participating in national fast days and days of prayer. They also frequently chronicled their political resistance. And in a previous publication, I focused on how Confederate women, through their diaries, we see their participation that's sometimes overlooked in this national event. So in their diaries, they write about their participation in protest, their wearing of Confederate colors when the Union soldiers occupy their towns, and their frequent engagement in political debate with those occupying Union troops. In the case of some of the diarists, they write about spying and smuggling letters across military lines. And Belle Edmondson from Tennessee is a good example of such a diary. When these diarists' political actions required them to deviate from traditional gender norms, their diaries were often a place of self-defense. And we see this often in the diaries of young Confederate women who resisted their parents' words of caution when interacting with Union troops. For example, 17-year-old Nanny Haskin Williams ignored her mother's rebuke that she hushed when verbally sparring with a Union lieutenant. In her diary, she defended her outspokenness and concluded that it was very successful as it shut him up completely. The Civil War diary was also a place of defense in regard to slavery. Elite Confederate women wrote one after another in attempts to reconcile abolitionist critiques with their own roles as slave mistress. For example, Dolly Lunt Burge, a 47-year-old widow who owned over 30 slaves, contemplated her role as a slave mistress as she anticipated Sherman's march through her home state of Georgia. While admitting abuses in the institution and her own misgivings, she used her diary entry to reason and come to the conclusion that, well, the Bible didn't forbid slavery. She knew good men who supported it, and she herself was a good slave mistress to the enslaved men, women, and children on her plantation. And often these entries come at a time of danger when women are expecting that confrontation with Union soldiers. As the purpose of self-defense illustrates, the audience for Confederate women's diaries is fluid. The entries that offered self-defense seem to be written for posterity, for an audience, but also for an audience of the self. These wartime diaries often served as a space for self-assurance and self-persuasion during the hardships of war. For women living close to the lines of fire, diaries were comfort during times of danger. For example, Mary Patrick in Arkansas picked up her diary after refusing advice to flee her home as she was in direct range of Union gunboats. Witnessing the smoke from the gunboats on the river outside her window, she wrote, "I concluded to write and try to allay my anxiety and quiet my nerves, but I find myself as though writing for life." These diaries were also a space for women to prepare for wartime challenges. Catherine spoke a little bit about this function of the diary and talking about, the diary pages serving as a space to try on different selves. And white elite Southern women did do such, their diaries served such functions. They were expected to maintain gender decorum, but also take on responsibilities usually reserved for their men. One of these roles was standing in place of men to protect their home from Union troops. And often they used their diary to prepare for and envision themselves as capable of such roles. In July 1862, 24-year-old Fanny Braxton Hume directed herself to, quote, take care of matters and of ourselves after her grandfather fled anticipating Union forces. Left alone with a house full of, her grandmother and sisters, she penned prayers for strength. And then at the end of this generative entry, concluded that she felt perfectly calm and ready to face what she described as an uncomfortable and potentially dangerous situation. As the Confederate women experienced war, the act of writing became a method for catharsis, self-calming, and what I term self-rhetorical preparation for often untraditional and sometimes dangerous responsibilities. And I'm happy to, answer any questions through email, anyone would like.
Thank you very much. I invite Lina Kurvet-Kar, who wrote about Estonian women's deportation diaries. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so hello everyone, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be included in this wonderful, wonderful volume. And I'm also really happy that it was published by Indiana University Press, because I'm a graduate of Indiana University. Yeah. But for now, I teach cultural theory and creative life writing at University of Tartu in Estonia, and my research focuses on Estonian life writing and Baltic women's life narratives of Stalinist deportations, also including the conceptual framework of trauma, and also everyday practices of life writing, such as the diary and correspondences. And actually, my PhD work was on women writers' diaries, including the diary of Virginia Woolf. And I work in close cooperation with the Cultural History Archive of the Estonian Literary Museum. And most recently, I initiated a public call for COVID-19 diaries. And I'm already slowly doing research on that.
That's nice. Lina, I have a question for you. Do women's diary in political conflict differ from men's diaries?
Well, thank you, Batsheva. And I don't know how well I can answer this question, but I can try to answer it based on my research. And when I take the context of my research, that is this Stalinist mass deportations from the Baltic states, then I think it's important to kind of take into consideration two contextual aspects. That when we talk about deportations, or as Lynn Viola uses this term, she uses Stalin's special settlements, then this repressive measure of deportation of the Soviet regime, it was directed against the most immediate communal context, and the most important of which was the family. And in the majority of cases, though it was one member of the family, usually the husband, who was charged, the whole family was deported. And upon deportation, men and women were separated. So men were sent to the Gulag, where most of them perished. And then women and the children and the elderly were sent to special settlements in different regions of Siberia. And therefore, I think there is definitely an intensified gender differentiation of the experience there that needs to be taken into account. But secondly, when I think of written sources that mediate this experience, and most of them are retrospective, the majority is authored by women. And the number of diaries, indeed, or any written records that date from the time spent in Gulag or the special settlements is very small. And the ratio of male and female authors among the preserved records is not a question of gender preference of a certain genre. I think it is rather a simple question of whose sex survived deportation and the forced labor camps. And my contribution to the volume focuses on a very unique source, the diary of an Estonian woman who was deported with her family, but ended up with her mother in a remote resettlement village in the Bondarka, approximately 5,000 kilometers from their home, that is near my hometown, Tartu. And the diary covers a period of almost 4.5 years. And on January 23, 1945, Erna was assigned to forestry work and caught under a falling tree and died. So she did not survive deportation, but very, very kind of uniquely, her diary did survive. And 50 years, almost 50 years after her death, it was sent back to Estonia to her brother, and later published by a small press. But I would like to continue with briefly highlighting the function of Erna's diary as a site of resistance and perhaps even a political tool. And I think that in particular, records of everyday life experience of deportation of women have not really been considered in such vein very much. And I must admit that in my own research, this aspect has emerged in the long run only. But firstly, Erna's determination to keep a diary may indicate that she did not fear going against the regulations that forbade keeping any record of this deportee life. And if discovered by authorities, Erna was prepared to face the consequences. But for Erna to resist her situation, her diary functions as a site where one's sense of being a self with an autonomous and significant identity is accomplished through the listing of trivial thoughts and mundane daily activities, quite like dominantly. For example, in September 1942, she writes, "Is this really me? This creature who eats, drinks, sleeps, is forced to slave away and is numb to all other thoughts and feelings." And this entry directly connects her mode of self-presentation and frame of mind with the context of her life dominated by a struggle to meet the work quotas to earn minimal food rations. And she really cannot exist or survive beyond the framework of these labor requirements. If she wouldn't have worked at all, she would have died sooner. But her diary highlights her efforts to resist these requirements and their effects on deportees, such as exhaustion and death. And in another entry from October 1941, she writes about inventing a religious holiday that requires her and her mother to stay at home and pray. And she writes that they even managed to convince the authorities that this was necessary. And so they were relieved of work duties on that day. And then she writes, "I am quite calm and I'm happy. How can anyone be happy in prison? But I don't even think about it. The sun is shining and I feel so good. Today I feel as if I am the sun and the wind." This is the title of the published diary. "I am one with all the hope, joy, and suffering of this world." And I think that these entries can be viewed as her way of refusing to be defined by these repressive regulations of the regime. And this is a way of retaining the freedom to choose one's attitude to extreme conditions. And for Tsvetan Todorov has written about it, and according to him, this can be viewed as an act of ordinary virtue, and this is also an act of resistance. And I think that to sum up, that as an extensive and detailed textual record, Erna Nagal's diary is a unique source of observation in social, political, and cultural context, but as a diaristic text, it capitalizes on mundane and trivial realities in their diverse manifestations. But through this, she emphasizes the importance of the diary as a site of survival, but I think as importantly, a site of resistance. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, before I invite the next, the next people, I just want to let you know that it seems that we'll go a little after 1:30. Maybe 10, 15 minutes. So now I invite Ben Nathans and Jochen Helbeck. Jochen wrote about Stalin era diary, and Ben is a historian specializing in Soviet Russia. We will have the pleasure of listening to their short conversation. So Jochen and Ben, please introduce yourself and start talking.
Yes, thank you, Batsheva.
Jochen,
go ahead, Ben.
I'm going to set the stage for you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a colleague of Batsheva and Dan. And as Batsheva said, I'm in the history department at Penn. And not least, I'm a huge fan of Jochen's book, Revolution on My Mind, which is really a landmark not only in the study of diary writing in extraordinary conditions, namely Stalinism, but has made a mark on the entire field of Soviet history by introducing the idea of a specifically Soviet subjectivity. Jochen, I turn it to you.
Well, I'm blushing, Ben. That was not called for. and it actually does not conform to the script, because to the extent that this our conversation was scripted, Batsheva said I should talk about myself for 20 seconds, but the rest is completely unbeknownst to me. So this is a very informal and unscripted conversation we're having. I want to just say that I've been studying the diary format for close to 30 years now, having found, through happenstance, a diary in Moscow in 1990 that launched me into this ongoing exploration that now I'm also combining with a study of diaries and subjectivities across front lines in World War II, with a focus on the Soviet and the German encounter in World War II.
So my first question for you, Jochen, you alluded to your discovery as a graduate student of a single diary. I assume you're referring to Stepan Podlubny's diary, but you built out from there, and you were a participant in the emergence of a corpus of diaries that rose up like a phoenix after the Soviet Union collapsed, and people became more willing to share documents from the Stalinist era. I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about the circumstances in which you began to discover these previously hidden and unknown diaries.
Yes, that's a great question. In fact, I would think that in this year 1990, or largely coinciding with the demise of the Soviet Union and the opening of the archives, everyone's eyes was attuned to diaries with the expectation that they would be sites of resistance toward the regime. I mean, this is classically what George Orwell also wrote about in 1984, Winston Smith using the diary to defy the big brother state. In fact, entire bibliographies were put out during this time that actually helped me find diaries, because they directed researchers to private archives, private publications of private sources from the 1930s, which again is not coincidental. The 1930s were considered to be that prime period because Nikita Khrushchev, in his de-Stalinization speech in 1956, had called attention to the 1930s as this period when ostensibly the revolution was derailed. And so that's what happened in the 1990s. A lot of 1930 sources were published, and that led me there. It was not my personal choice. But I think what I have come to discover is that, in fact, several of these diaries that I saw read very differently from my expectations. Like many others, I expected them to tell tales of resistance, and what I found were, in fact, personal strivings to conform to the norms of the Soviet Revolution, to essentially grant the Soviet Revolution, the Soviet revolutionary narrative, an internal subjective narrative. It's not a conflictless story. There's a lot of despair among authors that they did not get this right, or that the subjective eye does not align with the objective requirements. But more often than not, the conflict was resolved through attempts at rationalizing the higher truth and not actually questioning it.
You mentioned the disconnect between your expectations and the expectations of many people and what you actually found in these diaries. And of course, historians who do archival research love nothing more than to be surprised by what they find. After all, why go to all the trouble to travel to Moscow and other cities to dig into the archives only to find what you expected? But there was, as you mentioned, or as you alluded to, there was something troubling about what you found. And that was, and this was pointed out early on, that your work seemed to confirm at the most intimate level of human experience the power of the totalitarian model, or at least a version of the totalitarian model in which the official revolutionary narrative and the ideas and values that were embedded in it really did reach down all the way into the psyches and the consciousness of many, many Soviet citizens. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own struggle with the totalitarian paradigm, whether you resisted incorporating it into your work, whether you found yourself forced to modify it, and the resistance that you encountered in the reception of your work.
Yes. Well, let me start that. I actually sort of had to contend and fight on multiple fronts, because when I found this first diary in this Moscow archive, I was also given the telephone number of the diarist who had actually deposited the diary there just the year before. It was a wonderful encounter, but also one filled with multiple misunderstandings, because this author in his high age saw himself and wanted to see himself as a victim of the Stalinist period, and vigorously disputed many of my initial findings. And so on top of trying to negotiate the question that I will get to in a second, Ben, resolve the totalitarian framework, I had to in some sense defend or negotiate my views of a historical text with a surviving author. And I learned my skills as an oral historian only with a great delay. I still think it was a wonderful occasion. It seems to me that totalitarianism does not give a productive answer to the phenomenon of these Soviet diaries and their multitude. I prefer to think of the Soviet Revolution as a ferment that that extends to build officialdom, Soviet officialdom, but also that is engaged by multiple individuals on the ground who in fact do not have prescriptions from the regime to keep diaries. The diary is not something that the Soviet regime favors. It's way too individualistic. It is considered bourgeois. It is outside the purview of the Soviet state. So it's much safer to recite your autobiography in public, in the collectives. It's much safer to write in the public domain under control. And yet, so many Soviet citizens actually, especially of a younger age, embrace this format because they understand this as the call from the Soviet Revolution. So there is a thread that comes out from 1917 that I would not see as fully subsumed by officialdom. And I think this is essentially the negotiation that you see in the diary between the individuals as young Soviet citizens who are learning a Soviet language and a regime that's also trying to control this at the same time.
That was really wonderful. Thank you guys. Now I call Leonard Smith, who wrote about diaries of French soldiers in World War I. Len, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Since 1990, I've taught in the history department at Oberlin College. I spent the first quarter century of my career writing about French soldiers in the First World War. And my essay is sort of an extrapolation on a book about French soldiers' testimony published back in 2007. Also, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should say that this is not at all what I work on anymore. And so it was a real honor as well as a pleasure to have the opportunity to cast new eyes on some old interests. So thank you.
I love your book. Len, I have a question. Can you talk about the use of the personal diary in historical research?
Sure.
Issues of generalizations, representations, validity, I don't know, in using subjective material. Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. To my mind, the diary illustrates a central problem in how it is that experience becomes experience through the written text. There is, I think, a structural tension between recording experience accurately, in scare quotes, and recording it in a way that makes sense. I mean, one way of thinking about time is as something that proceeds from now to now to now to now. And you can think of a diary as operating in this way, typically from day to day to day. It is in this sense authentic because it's immediate. It could also be at some level unsatisfying because you can't tell where the story goes because there is no story. There's a succession of nows, of todays. So a raw diary can become something else and can bring experience into the broader domain by becoming some kind of narrative. Now, it might still be a diary, but it might become something else altogether. So my essay explores two examples from two famous French soldiers of the Great War whose diaries became something else altogether. Henri Barbusse, the author of what is to this day the best-selling French World War I novel, Le Feuille, Under Fire, first published in 1916, and Marc Bloch, the renowned historian of medieval Europe, later a resistance hero and resistance martyr in the Second World War. Now, Barbusse certainly was seen and certainly saw himself as the Émile Zola of the trenches. He was certainly of the left, was a devoted communist down to his death in 1930, and made his claims to truth in all of his writings on two foundations. One is simply the ideological message that the Great War had to result in the global triumph of socialism. The means, and really the reason for which Barbusse became known, is as really a pioneer of the kind of literary devices of the ghastly imagery of mutilated and putrefying flesh as a result of combat in the First World War. Now, Barbusse made, I argue, 3 attempts at a diary driven by an apocalyptic notion of time. And I think this is the key to understanding Barbusse, apocalypse, in which time itself runs towards some pivotal event that literally resets time. An apocalypse is not an end. An apocalypse is also a beginning, such as the coming of the Messiah for Jews or the second coming for Christians. Barbusse's first diary was skeletal, to say the least. It mechanically records dates and places and recounts, in this highly skeletal way, his own transition from civilian to soldier to front soldier. It ends significantly when Barbusse himself arrives at the front. It's his own kind of apocalyptic moment when he has become something else, when his personal time resets. A second version is written sometime later when he's away from the front, but still in uniform. And it's really a series of sketches for the novel, including some early experiments in the ghastly imagery for which he later became famous. The third, I would argue, is the novel itself, which ends with predicting the transformation of the world through victory. Okay, it is not contrary to popular belief an anti-war novel at all. It's a book that advocates the transformation of the world through victory in this war. Now, Marc Bloch developed a very different conception of time from Barbusse and left very different diaries. In fact, Bloch wrote 2 versions of a diary, one a highly fragmentary day-by-day account that he kept for the entire duration of the war. He finishes it shortly, he stops keeping this version shortly after, before his demobilization. But by the end of the war, it's just a list of dates and places, day after day after day, date and place, date and place. He started writing a more narrative account in late 1914, after he was evacuated first for illness and then did a sojourn and occupation duty basically in Algeria. Once he returns to Europe, once he returns to the Western Front, he actually gave up this more narrative version. And I became very interested in what is this about? Why would Bloch keep an immediate skeletal diary for the duration, but give up this more narrative approach to a diary? I would argue that Marc Bloch, in fact, had great humility about eyewitness testimony, whether in a diary or anywhere else. He certainly believed it was valuable, and he advocated very publicly collecting as much of it as possible, as quickly as possible. But Bloch believed that witnesses, by definition, lacked the critical scholarly distance necessary to evaluate their own testimony. And this, I think, is why he stopped writing his own narrative account. The historian could not be his own historian. Okay? But then why, if he can't really narrate, why did he continue the skeletal day by day by day account? This, I believe, spoke to a deeply patriotic conception of a structure of time. Marc Bloch's dual proud identity as a Frenchman of Jewish origin is well known. It is something that was well known at the time. But what I think is going on here is that France to Marc Bloch was eternal. France would continue. Whatever happened to Marc Bloch, whatever happened in the Great War, whatever happened to the French army. And if you conceive time in this way, in the community of which you are a member, or the communities of which you are a member in this way, the passage of time is the story. The passage of time is the story. It is the narrative. Okay? As witness, Bloch could record this time, this narrative, day by day by day by day. As historian, however, Bloch turned his attention to much deeper structures of time, what the Annales school that he helped found would call the longue durée, or the historical long run. And during the war itself, once he gave up writing his own more narrative version of his diary, he would begin, actually would at the front, would begin resuming writing about the scholarly interests that he would pick up again after the war in medieval history. So in this highly oblique way, I think de Block, writing medieval history, particularly to some extent during, but especially after the war, became his diary. The deep structures of time that he felt capable of narrating. My final pitch then is that I think in very different ways, Henri Barbusse and Marc Bloch both show us what historians can bring to the table in thinking about the diary. And I think that historians can help us find traces of the diary in texts that don't appear to be diaries at all, and can show, as do many of the essays in this volume, show the immense influence of the diary on other forms of writing. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, we will conclude with three scholars who will talk about diaries online. Desiree Henderson, who wrote and will talk about digitized diaries. Jill Walker-Redberg, who wrote and will comment about online diaries and blogs. And Julie Rack, who wrote about the diary among other forms of life writing, and who will interview Desiree and Jill after they conclude their respective comments. So please, ladies.
I guess I'm starting, yes? Hi, everyone. My name is Desiree Henderson. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Texas, Arlington, and I'm the author of the book, How to Read a Diary, Critical Context and Interpretive Strategies for 21st Century Readers, which was published by Routledge in 2019. I want to begin by congratulating Batsheva and Dan on this achievement, and thank you for all the work that you did to make the volume possible. My essay in the collection that we're here to celebrate today is about digitized diaries. As a researcher, I've had the opportunity to travel to and conduct research on diaries in some of the most important and well-known archives in the United States, including the opportunity to touch and hold and turn the pages of incredible manuscript diaries from the 18th and 19th centuries. And as a result, to analyze their material form, their size and paper and the writing instruments that were used, the handwriting, the binding, illustration, so forth. All the aspects of handwritten diaries that are so important to conducting manuscript studies or history of the book scholarship. As a teacher of diaries, I wanted to bring some of that archival excitement to my classes, but although I've had fruitful partnerships with the special collections at UT Arlington, working with their collection of manuscript diaries, my options for archival teaching are still pretty limited by my geographic area. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I started gathering examples of digitized diaries or manuscript diaries in digital form, at first for my students as a teaching aid, and then as others became interested for the general public, I created a blog called The Diary Index, or diaryindex.com, that gathers every digitized diary that I know of from all over the world. As of today, there are over 350 linked diaries or collections of diaries on my website, which is hardly exhaustive, but does give a sense of how much material is out there. In the process of gathering these materials in one place and using them to teach my students, I realized I was observing in real time a sea change in diary studies, the same kind of transformational change that digitization is having across literary studies generally, as more and more previously restricted materials become publicly available on digital platforms. So my essay in the diary volume takes a stab at thinking about what the implications of this sea change are for the study of individual digitized diaries, for example, what kinds of questions we need to ask about access and platforms or interfaces and modes of engagement. But I also seek to explore the larger implications for the field as our objects of study increase in number and in diversity of form, origin, language, author identity, etc. I try to account for the ways in which digitization is enriching the field of study, but at the same time, I examine the consequences surrounding the fact that these materials are being encountered and explored through a digital interface, that they have been transformed by the process of digitization. So I'm not a digital humanities scholar. I've never digitized a diary. So my essay is not approaching the topic of digitization from the technical side, as in what ethical or intellectual concepts should guide whether diaries are digitized, or what technological tools should be employed to do the work of digitization. Those are questions that someone else can tackle. Instead, my essay comes at this issue from the perspective of a user, someone who relies on digitized editions as their primary access to certain texts, which is closer to the perspective that our students might have if they work with these materials. And this perspective puts me in the position to consider what the new ongoing proliferation of digitized diaries has to teach us about these fascinating, challenging works, both what is enabled and what is hindered by digital resources. I'm honored to have my contribution included in this volume alongside so many of the scholars who have shaped my own understanding of the diary genres. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. Jill? Where are you?
Hi, I'm Jill Walker-Repberg. I'm a professor of digital culture at the University of Bergen in Norway. And I was so thrilled to be invited to write this chapter on online diaries and blogs in this anthology. I think it's wonderful to be included in such a rich book that I actually think will also be of great interest to other people studying the digital sort of, not the afterlife, but the extensions perhaps of the diary. So I'm very happy about this book. I just wanted to talk about a few of the points I make in my chapter. It has a history of online diaries and so forth a little bit, but most importantly, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the differences between online diaries and diaries like this. This is one I started when I was 7. As you can see, it's very neat. I definitely knew the genre conventions, a page for each day. I write fascinating things about what I did in the sandpit. It's lovely. So that's your very traditional diary in a sense, and those definitely exist online, perhaps more so in the early parts. We had websites like opendiary.com and LiveJournal, which were very much built around the knowing that all the users would know what a diary was like, right? And so there's daily entries, there's a fairly limited audience, and so there's a sense of actually sharing private things. But they are social. Now the social diary, as many of you will know, it's, yes, there's the private, very personal diary, but there's diaries like Virginia Woolf's, which she did expect others would read. This is my high school diary. I don't know if these were common. I grew up in Norway, so we all had these Garfield diaries. This is 1988 to 89. And as you can see, it's quite multimodal. Here's a train ticket and an autumn leaf. And there's I know this is all mirror writing, but that doesn't matter. You can see there's like homework assignments, read page this, do those assignments. There's a few lines that are just traditional diary entry, like what I actually did that day. But what I think is particularly interesting about this diary is that we would pass them around in the classroom. And this is where it connects to social media, I think, because there's several writing. I mean, there's notes people passed me, which is really fun to still have, but we all had these diaries and we passed them around. And so there's notes written in from my friends in several handwritings. So I think one of the things that interests me about digital culture and digital media is that there are these long historical lines. Yes, there are new things, but it's not all completely new. Another important thing I think about online diaries is that often, and particularly now, I think now the new generation that starts writing diaries online might not have the same genre conventions as I did growing up in the 70s and 80s. But social media tends to provide these prompts, and here's another of my diaries. This is a very formulaic pregnancy diary. It has, the questions that you fill out. I got a bit carried away. This was, my last baby didn't get one like this, but it's got, the descriptions of the different things. I'm sure you've seen similar books. They have wedding journals, they have all sorts of journals like that. Social media does this immensely, Facebook isn't really a diary, but it has diary-like elements. And then it throws back your memories at you. You realize that, oh, it's sort of keeping track of my life. And I'm also very interested in these other ways in which social media and now digital media capture moments of our lives in ways that feel a bit like diaries. And I think in Julie Rock's chapter, you mentioned about the tracking, the timekeeping aspect. You keep a diary, you write, which is, you keep a diary like you keep a financial record. And that is one of the origins of diaries, is that sort of sense of accounting. And I do think that a lot of digital media use that a lot. So, you know, you've got your self-tracking devices, your Runkeeper. I don't have it out now. I was going to show you my Goodreads, which produces like an overview of all the books I read last year, which feels like another way of sort of representing myself through diaries. So I think there are fewer traditional diaries online now than there were 15 years ago, but there's a lot of diary-ish forms sort of spreading out, which are fascinating.
Julie?
That's fantastic. Thanks both to Desiree and Jill for just such a lively discussion around the transitions and the non-transitions between paper or the idea of the material and digital, whether that's actually material also. So I'm Julie Rack. I'm a H.M. Torrey professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. And I have different and eccentric entry points into the world of diary criticism, partly because my main area of research is life writing studies, which is larger than just diaries. But most of you do not know that I actually wrote about Dukhobor diaries. These are Russian-speaking people who were forced to leave Russia in the 19th century and migrated to Canada and are quite famous for being Christian anarchists. And I wrote about diaries by people who were imprisoned for trying to burn down or blow up government buildings, other people's buildings, to show their defiance of materialism. They didn't want materialism. And there's a lot of other reasons, and also for being nude in public, which was a crime punishable in British Columbia. You could be put in jail for up to 12 years, anywhere between 6 and 12 years, very serious. And so many of the diaries I study, which included things scratched on walls or written down on receipts from stores, were circulated in Russian, but were never appeared anywhere. And as far as I know, I'm the only person ever to write about them. So I'm fascinated to hear other people, including historians. Jakob Helbeck, I really appreciated your discussion of Soviet diaries in particular, to talk about what the legacy of those kinds of materials means. So I'm sure all of you understand that. And of course, I had helped to translate and publish Philippe Legeune's essays in English on diary, which I felt we needed more theoretical thinking about the diary in English, and that was really why I decided to do that with Jeremy Popkin. So anyway, let's talk about digital things for a minute. So I have a question each for Desiree and Jill, but what I would like to do also is just invite you both to unmute and talk together, because I think actually you have things to say to each other. And so the first question that I have, I'll direct to Desiree, but I'm really happy to have Jill weigh in, which is really about how is our research going to change if we understand in terms of what social editions mean. So just to give you context, in Desiree's arguments, she talks a bit about the pros and cons of collective work on diaries. So diaries are often, you know, when we study them, and we as academic, we have them in the ivory tower, and that's where they seem to be, right? And we have this weird thing where they never go anywhere, like what I just told you. You would never know about this Dukhobor diaries unless I told you. So the phenomenon of digitizing diaries and having crowdsourced editing, how's that? You kind of, in your essay, you say that there's problems with it because it's not scholarly, but what's the potential? So let's talk a little bit about the potential of switching up or changing how we read diaries. Let's, when the people get a hold of it.
Well, of course, you're right. That if the people get a hold of it, great things can happen. And there are these amazing transcription projects. I'm thinking specifically of the Smithsonian, which is running this kind of constant ongoing project of multiple transcription transcriptions of diaries all are just open, available online. People can just jump in and transcribe. So the work gets done, which is huge. And transcribing diaries is hard work, as many people on this panel can attest. So having the work done by anyone, first of all, is wonderful. So the place where I get a little, worried has to do with what happens with that material. So does it belong to the Smithsonian? Is all that labor sort of is it free labor that's being donated to an institution? Who has a copyright, or is there copyright associated with a transcribed diary that's been mass produced? Where does it reside? Will it be accessible to everyone? So there's sort of access questions that follow even after the transcription has happened that I worry a little bit about, mostly because it's uncharted territory. We just don't, there aren't good rules. There isn't best practices maybe that can maybe guide us. But you might have some ideas about this, Julie. I have a feeling you might.
I have an idea or two. One thing is that we often act like the diary is not mediated. And then when we mediate, we do something or interfere. But in a sense, every time we read a diary, we mediate it, because so many of them weren't meant to be read by us in particular. So I'm wondering, Jill, your discussion around sharing and how sharing is a non-digital practice. And I absolutely agree. That idea that the digital is a departure, I tend to think of it as often an extension or a modification myself. Could you talk a little bit about this issue in this way? Like, is sharing going to change how we read? Did you at 7 change what you wrote or put little leaves into your book because you knew someone would read it? If that's true, can that affect how we understand digital editing?
I'm pretty sure I proudly showed it to my mother, and the diary goes on till I'm like 14, but not very thoroughly. But what happened is my mum would later, when I was like 10 or 11, my mum would photocopy letters I wrote to my grandmother and then staple them into the diary, which now is fantastic, right? Because it does give a certain record of my life at the time, but it's not quite what a diary is meant to be, really. But yeah, that probably is a very naive sort of sharing diary. The diary I wrote when I was 16, I found when I was 25 and burnt out of compassion, I think, for my 16-year-old self. I don't know if I would still do that. I have another friend who didn't burn her teenage diary. She put it in a sealed envelope to read when her daughter became the same age, to sort of help her understand it. But yes, I mean, Viviane Serfati, in her book on blogs from 2004, talks about how the Puritans shared. I mean, there is one tradition of diaries which is very much about this sort of self-improvement, sharing things in order to sort of reflect upon the self in a communal way. And I do think we definitely see that in blogs, like things like diet blogs or working out on where you track it or you write about it, or there are a lot of sort of self-improvement projects where that sort of social element of some kinds of diary writing is very evident, for sure.
Yeah, we have some eminent people in this very call who would be able to say, but Benjamin Franklin was there first. Yep. Oh, yes, he was.
Yes.
In order to understand that, then, sharing may not be an aberration around diary discourse. And in fact, as many people have said already here, the idea of the absolute privacy of the diary may be overrated, or may be more like culturally contingent. It depends on the situation. So if you've been deported and you're in Estonia, of course you don't want anyone to read this. You're writing for a record, but you don't even know who's going to read it, right? But you sure know who you don't want to have read that, right?
Yeah.
And that's true also of the Holocaust fragment diaries. Once things that they didn't even know what would happen to those, right? Like very, very moving to see them, because they're writing for a future they don't think they have. So when we think about that, that's one kind, but then there's this other one. And I think that the digital world, from what I'm hearing you say, Jill, is really, it's a continuous thing around sharing. So what I want to ask you about is self-tracking actually diary practice? In your essay, you say no, yes, I don't know. And now I want to, and then it's the $1 billion question, because Kylie Cardell in the same collection has said, well, yes. And we have also Lena Buford says the diary is over, it's doomed, which I just am like, really? What? And she's not here for me to say that. So I'm going to ask you, really, what do you think about self-tracking? Do you think it's even diary practice? What is this?
I think it is a kind of diary practice. I think it's about this sort of need to represent ourselves in different ways, right? In order to see who we are and understand ourselves. And I think that doesn't go away. There's a lot of, I mean, there are many of those diary practices. In my chapter, I mentioned my grandmother's travel diary, which is incredibly sparse. Not that different from self-tracking. I think we can probably count it as definitely diary-ish, for sure.
Yeah, I love that idea of the diary-ish. I actually think that if we're thinking about diaries and the idea of rhetoric and literature, we need to think a little more about the rhetoric of this stuff. What is diary discourse and how does it actually float into other areas of representation? We've heard a couple of people already talk a little bit about how the diary has actually influenced other things, including novel discourse, right? For example, which it often doesn't get credit for. So to bring all this back, and I just want to know for Desiree, like, so what would you say is the takeaway for us around how diaries of the past can be read in the present? And the reason why I say that is increasingly students in this generation now who are in their 20s are unable to read cursive writing. So what do you think should happen? Are we really looking at it like as if it's medieval manuscripts? Are we really looking at an active translation? How do you think we should deal with the weird form that is the diary for our students?
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the first things that happens when I put a digitized diary in front of my students is they say, well, we can't read it because like, look, this is weird. This handwriting is incomprehensible. And where's the transcription, right? They just sort of want to go to the transcription, which may or may not be provided. Some do and some don't. But I also think what an amazing gift to have the opportunity to show our students such a wide range of manuscript forms and formats and contents that in the past we just simply wouldn't have been able to. And that does open up a large number of possibilities for our students to themselves explore, you know, to find out sort of new pathways. What I notice is that having my students look at digitized manuscripts from the 18th century, the 19th century, it does flow into their own diary writing practices, which I am often requiring them to do. That there is again, exactly what you said, it flows both across the digital divide, and then it flows back in. So there is a wonderful mutual shaping that happens.
I think mutual shaping is an excellent way. So to end this part of things, diaries actually have an afterlife. To say, Jill says it's not just an afterlife, it's a continuity into other media. So really the suggestion that I'm getting from both of you is we need to be transmedial in thinking about this. There's an example in Canada, which is that there's a producer on CBC who goes across the country and asks people to read excerpts from their childhood diaries on radio. And these have been so funny that at one point I almost crashed my car listening to somebody talk about, you know, their early lives, you know, dear diary, I hate boys, also summer camp, you know, that kind of stuff. And so that's an example of transmediation, right? Where a diary might be written, and your childhood self might have written it if that's even you, but it somehow turns into a fun house in another media. So that's really what I'm getting from there. And on that note, I'm thinking, next thing to write about, bullet journals.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Don't know what they are. Have fun, everybody, because that is a form of the diary that nobody anticipated was going to be a big deal. And that makes the material and the digital combine in unusual ways. So I'm excited for this collection. I'm excited for how much and how rich the material is here. I was really honored to write for it. I wrote about life writing in the diary form, and but there's so much else to see in there. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to get that book, get it right now. Thanks to both of you for being so energetic, fun, and also really informative about what are we going to think about the diary in the digital era. Thank you. And thanks to Batsheva and Dan also.
Wow, this is great, wonderful. Okay, Neely was supposed to close with closing remarks with thank you, but she had to leave because she's teaching a class. So I will close it and thanking you all for joining and for being such an attentive audience. And I would like to express much gratitude to our generous host, University of Pennsylvania Comparative Literature and a Literary Theory program, its chair, Emily Wilson, and coordinator, Joanne Dubel, and the Jewish Studies program and its director, Catherine Hellerstein, and administrator, Chrissy Welsh. Heartfelt thanks to Indiana University Press, its director, Gary Dunham, who I loved him from the moment he said, I don't want to hurt the integrity of the book. And the editorial staff who worked on the book, Janice Frisch, Alison Chaplin-Blair, Lee McLennan, Rachel Rosalina Aaron, and Indiana University Press creative team. Special appreciation to Chris Pasananti from the University of Pennsylvania Multimedia Service. And finally, thank you from our esteemed panel. You're wonderful. Your colleagues and friends, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Julie.
Hey, everybody show.